In space, we could see for the first time what we had already known. Water is the life of this planet. We were always at home at the edges of the seas, the shoreline coasts and bays that allowed us to venture out and then return safely. Indians were here first. They called themselves the Narragansetts, the people of the little bays. They swam in these waters, caught fish in the coves, and crossed from island to island in their dugout canoes. They knew how abundant life was beneath the surface of these waters. The living creatures of the bay move through a silent and mysterious world. The seasons turn, and the sun and tides move in ancient cycles and rhythms. Of all the creatures which depend on the bay, only man can change it. Only man can choose how to perceive it. This is Beaver Tail, on the southern tip of Connecticut Island, what most people call Jamestown. I'm Richard Kneeland. Like most Rhode Islanders, I love the bay. And like most Rhode Islanders, I sometimes take it for granted. But could any one of us imagine living here without it? If we take a closer look at the bay, we may be able to discover something about it and about ourselves. We'll look at it as a friend might study the contours of a familiar face, with interest, affection, and concern. If you were to draw a line from Whale Rock in Narragansett over to here, then from here to Breton Point in Newport, and finally to Saconnet Point, you would have enclosed what most people consider Narragansett Bay. North of us is almost 100 square miles of water. Along it, bluffs, inlets, coves, and salt marshes. The oceans may be eternal, but delicate estuaries like Narragansett Bay are fairly recent creations of vast and powerful forces. 16,000 years ago, there was no bay here, just 2 or 3 rivers draining a broad plain. Then came the cold. A A series of great ice sheets advanced through the area, grinding, scouring, and crushing the landscape, picking up sand, gravel, and boulders as they moved. When they stopped, they dropped deposits to form what geologists call terminal moraines. We call them Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket, and Block Island. As it retreated, the last glacier left behind it a layer of clay, sand, gravel, and cobbles. So except for the bedrock peeking out in places like Newport and Beavertail, this is what Rhode Islanders live on, a thick blanket of glacial debris. Underneath the waters of the bay, the quality of the rock will be of particular concern if you intend to anchor something permanent to it, like a bridge.
This particular rock, this darker rock, is about 300 million years old. And this rock was actually laid down in freshwater swamps. This area that we know as Narragansett Bay consisted of both valleys and hills. The three valleys are East Passage, West Passage, and Sakonnet Passage. These passages were in existence prior to the advance of the ice. What you have here is about 195 feet of sediment in this part of the passage. And it's the composition of this sediment that is very critical in stabilizing the foundation for the bridge. The deepest channel presently goes back to the pre-Ice Age drainage system. The extension of the ancient Providence River was the dominant valley, and all of the other drainage went into the Providence River as it flowed to the open sea.
Tides ebb and flow dramatically through the bay, but they account for less real motion in the water than you might expect. What really carries things along is the difference in salt content between the seawater surging into the bay and the fresh water coming down from the north. Narragansett Bay is one of the most studied bodies of water of its kind in the world. But its usually stable and predictable waters can be whipped into a fury by a tropical depression moving up the coast. As much as we know about the bay, in a hurricane, all bets are off. Since its founding, Rhode Island has been struck by 9 severe storms, but 2 hurricanes in this century have engraved themselves upon the living memories of Rhode Islanders and become a part of the folklore of the state. The 1938 hurricane struck without warning, and the long arms of the bay funneled and lifted its storm surge toward Providence. During a long night, over 200 lives were lost in the state. In 1954, Hurricane Carol took fewer lives and caused less damage, but it still rewrote the coastline and treated Rhode Islanders to the spectacle of their capital city awash in the waters of the bay. Unpredictable and infrequent hurricanes are still a natural part of the life of the bay. Normally, the bay winds are remarkably consistent, from the northwest during the winter and from the southwest during the summer. On hot summer days when the heated air rises from the land, the cooler air from the ocean is drawn inland, and everyone living near the bay is refreshed by the sea breeze. The same winds blew over the earliest settlers, who called it the sea turn, and over the Narragansett Indians, who believed that the souls of their dead migrated to the southwest and its soft winds. From April to September, the offshore waters are warmed by the sun and gradually exchanged with the waters of the bay, a process that takes from 12 to 40 days. These shifts in temperature trigger many of the complex changes that affect the underwater life within the bay. Few people are more at home in the living systems of the bay than a marine biologist.
Narragansett Bay to a diver is a rich, wild, natural area. it's just a fascinating place to dive because there's so much in it. It's a biology-dominated bay, and the plants and animals are beautiful to behold and interesting to catch, to look at, and some of them to eat. But unlike southern clearer waters, the bay is turbid. The turbidity of the bay is because of its richness. Its very richness makes the bay somewhat cloudy to swim in. But this richness, which is plankton, supports a wide variety of invertebrate life of plants and animals that couldn't live otherwise, and makes the bottom community into a very interwoven and rich tapestry of life that is really fascinating to a lot of people who dive in the bay.
The bay has been here for thousands of years. We've been here less than 400. Return with us when we look at how we've used the bay during our brief history as Rhode Islanders. In 1524, the first European to visit the bay was an Italian navigator exploring the New World, Giovanni di Verrazzano. This is how he described Narragansett Bay in a letter to his patron, the King of France. Within the haven are 5 small islands, very fruitful and pleasant, full of high and broad trees. We were often inland, he told the king, which we found as pleasant as possible, very apt for any kind of husbandry of corn, wine, and oil. For there are plains 25 leagues broad, and of such fruitfulness that any seed sown therein will bring forth most excellent fruit. Well, the King of France was not interested in planting fruit trees, thank you very much. His sea captains were looking for wealth, for a route to the Orient. So Verrazzano's safe anchorage, his fruitful and pleasant land, remained the province of the Narragansett and Wampanoag Indians. Astonishingly, after Verrazzano's visit, more than 100 years passed with no mention of Narragansett Bay in the annals of the explorers. Then, in the 17th century, the English arrived, and they came to stay. In 1636, the first English colonists found a welcoming shoreline. The climate was healthy, the bay was full of fish, and the Indians had already cleared the land around the shore for their own summer gardens. The earliest settlers were sailors, fishermen, and farmers, and during the next century, they turned Rhode Island into an Eden. Some called it the Garden of New England, famous for its oxen, fast horses, and great flocks of sheep. A maritime trade quickly arose. Butter, wool, and fish were shipped to other colonies, and to the plantations of the West Indies went lumber and charcoal. From over 40 distilleries in Newport, rum was traded for slaves in West Africa. In Rhode Island, many of the grandest fortunes and the whitest mansions were built on the dark heart of the slave trade. But wars between the European powers often disrupted normal trade, and Rhode Island merchants, who rarely shrank from any profitable enterprise, eagerly became pirates and privateers in the unsettled years before the Revolution. And so it was politics and profits that motivated a band of raiders to burn the revenue cutter Gaspee. Britain was stung by this early act of rebellion, but she had bigger guns in reserve.
When the HMS Rose came to Newport, it was to formally cope with the problem of Rhode Island smuggling. And it was infrequent that Narragansett Bay during the colonial period was visited by one of these. Certainly it was unusual for it to be visited by one of these that was hostile to what it was doing. And so its presence was an awesome one. Rhode Island being the ocean state, its only resource was the bay and the ocean beyond. And to interfere, to interdict in any way on the Rhode Island trade was to incite the Rhode Islanders, and they acted violently. There are historians that believe that the revolution began here in Narragansett Bay as early as 1764, like 10 or 11 years before the shot heard around the world at Lexington and Concord. And it happened where? Right on the waters of this bay.
After the Revolution, Rhode Island merchants pioneered in opening trade with the Orient. The voyage to China could last as long as 2 years, but Rhode Island merchants like John Brown were willing to take the risk, since enormous profits could be made from the sale of tea, silk, china, and lacquerware. Today, Narragansett Bay hosts a different kind of trade with the Orient. Only a shadow of the decades when Rhode Island ships were at home in every port in the world. A few years after the state's great merchant families turned from shipping to industrial development, their role in the state's maritime history was gradually taken over by the United States Navy. After the Civil War, Naval Captain Stephen Luce began a campaign to turn Newport into a major training area. Over the next 100 years, thousands of young seamen would come here to discover what it meant to learn the ropes and to pull your own weight. On Coaster's Harbor Island, what had been the Newport Poorhouse became the Naval War College, the center for the Navy's strategic planning during World War II. Officers from every service came here to discuss tactics and simulate combat. Throughout the war, the Navy was a major presence on Narragansett Bay. PT boats hummed across the water, while Quonset Point and Davisville were the site of a carrier base and the home of the Seabees, the famed construction battalions of the Navy. But one of the bay's vital contributions to the war was the torpedo. In Newport, on Rhode Island, over 13,000 workers in 3 shifts fabricated torpedoes, which were then tested in the waters off Gould Island. 80% of the torpedoes used in the Second World War were produced in Newport. Today, the tradition of torpedo development, which began in 1869, continues at the Naval Underwater Systems Center. What had been a simply crafted brass cylinder has now become a weapon of terrifying power. Since the Revolution, the bay has been protected by a formidable string of defenses, but one route, apparently, was left unguarded. In 1916, before the United States had joined the war, a German U-boat surfaced unexpectedly in the bay to post a letter, the captain said. Celebrated ashore, the Germans repaid their welcome by returning to sea and sinking 6 unarmed British merchant ships off the coast of Nantucket. Some of the survivors made their way back to Newport and their day to be celebrities. Between 1836 and World War II, steamboats were a dominant part of life on the bay. Connected to an ever-growing system of railroads, steamers like the Rhode Island offered transportation that was cheap, efficient, and sometimes even opulent. Ferries linked the mainland and the major islands of the bay, but now the automobile had arrived. and with it, demands for quicker access to bay communities. When the Mount Hope Bridge was built, it was the world's largest suspension bridge, and when it was opened in 1929, everybody came to the party. The Jamestown Bridge followed in 1940, but it was the completion of the Newport Bridge in 1969 that finally linked the major islands with the mainland and subtly changed the nature of the bay. Now, Connecticut and Aquidneck Islands, whose first inhabitants had shouted their greetings to Verrazano, could be easily reached by other visitors, by everyone attracted to the natural beauty and rich history of Narragansett Bay. The story of the bay has been painted in broad strokes and in smaller ones as well. Come back and see how work and recreation fit into the picture. Rhode Islanders really began using the bay for recreation in the 19th century, when there was suddenly a new thing called leisure time. No, not much of it, mind you. Not if you worked in a factory. Your only day off was Sunday. And more than likely you'd spend it on the bay. Not behind the wheel of a sloop like this. That was for the owners of the factories. But perhaps on a skiff, a canoe, or a catboat. Yet what became a playground for thousands of Rhode Islanders was still a workplace to those men who trawled and dredged and fished these waters. Of course, they would likely spend their day off out on the bay too, with their families, enjoying the simple gift of sun and salt air. The public's right to Narragansett Bay had been guaranteed in the charter that Roger Williams negotiated with King Charles in 1663. The earliest Rhode Islanders and their descendants have exercised that right with particular enthusiasm. Since the 19th century, the industrial development that made it easier to reach the bay has also spurred its growth as a recreational resource. Along the bay, steamships had given way to ferries, and ferries to roads and bridges. But the direction of travel on a summer day had not changed, toward the water, and to that essential element of a day's outing, a clam bake. The Indians of Narragansett Bay had shown the earliest settlers how to steam open soft-shelled clams. And although the principle hadn't changed much in 300 years, the scale of the operation certainly did. By the turn of the century, every bay resort, hotel, or amusement park had to include among its offerings a shore dinner or clam bake. Only a 5-minute walk from the steamship landing, an East Providence hotel advertised in 1890. The trifling sum of 40 cents will secure you a first-class shore dinner. The growth of the bay as a place for recreation seems curiously linked to the fortunes of the three bivalves we call steamers, quahogs, and oysters. Oysters were once the bay's most important food product. Carefully transplanted from seed stalks and nurtured in specially prepared beds, they dominated the bay's commercial fishery. In 1908, for example, almost 9 million pounds were marketed. Oysters have disappeared from the bay. And now, soft-shelled clams, the steamers that are the centerpiece of any respectable shore dinner, are becoming increasingly scarce in Rhode Island waters.
What I have here are some native Rhode Island steamers. They're not too much available commercially. That is why they're really a treat for the customer. You pay a higher price for them, and that is the main reason that they are marked up so high on retail.
Today, the quahog is the king of bivalves in the bay. In the folklore of the state, the quahog has come to be considered almost a symbol of Rhode Island. But it is surprising how many things we don't know about these creatures. Accurate estimates of the population are difficult to obtain. Nobody knows better than the quahoggers themselves how elusive the clams can be. Abundant in one area of the bay, yet not to be found in another. The men who go out every day to rake the bottom with long-handled tongs are the latest generation of Rhode Island baymen who have successfully worked the oyster, scallop, and quahog fisheries. It is an occupation that develops a strong back and an equally strong sense of independence.
I started this about 4 or 5 years ago. I got laid off from the mill. Started off slow, but each year I find myself doing a little bit better every year. It's peace of mind, very relaxing. No boss is telling you how much production to put out. Every day you know what you have to dig in order to make ends meet with the bills that you have.
Even though it is harder to find a traditional clam bake nowadays, with its earthen pit and mounds of clams, corn, and lobsters surfacing through the steam, the word still has magic. It evokes those days when 10,000 people would be served in a single day at Rocky Point, when all the ingredients in a clam bake, from the humble steamers to lobsters, would have been drawn from the waters of the bay. It is an image of abundance. The pleasantest angling is to see the fish cut with her golden oars the silver stream and greedily devour the treacherous bait. The lines are from Much Ado About Nothing, and even though Rhode Island fishermen are probably more at home with a rod and reel than a volume of Shakespeare, few would disagree with the sentiment. Whether the quarry is striped bass, bluefish, or tautog, few sports can match the combination of excitement and relaxation offered by a day spent fishing on the bay. Because Narragansett Bay lies along the boundary between northern and southern fish populations, it is visited by a remarkable variety of fish. Herring from the north, scaup from the south, over 100 different species each year to tempt or confound the fishermen. The tradition of fishing on the bay runs strong and deep. More than a sport or a pastime, it is a legacy, part of our bond with this remarkable body of water. It demands patience and skill. In many families, these virtues are carefully passed on from father to son, or from father to daughter. Since the days of the India trade, Rhode Island had been known for the design of her sailing craft. So it was not surprising that boating on Narragansett Bay became a prime source of recreation during the 19th century, and that one of the geniuses of naval design came from Bristol, Rhode Island. Nathaniel Green Harrishoff began to design steam vessels in his brother's boatyard in 1878. But in the early 1890s, he turned to the design of sailing yachts, and here he had no equal. When the Harrishoff J-boat Enterprise beat Shamrock 5, the challenger for the America's Cup in 1930, it was one of 8 times that ships of Captain Nat's design successfully defended yachting's oldest trophy. Today, the few vessels being built on the bay are made of fiberglass, not wood, and the recreational fleet has become an armada of pleasure boats of every size and description. Sailing on the bay has long been a democratic pastime. Besides the catboats and gaff-headed sloops of the yacht clubs, there have always been smaller craft available for the weekend sailor. But new lightweight materials and innovative designs have brought the essential pleasures of sailing and boating within the reach of even more Rhode Islanders. The deep water passages are avenues for the commercial vessels, and a small craft owner needn't be a maritime lawyer to know who has the right of way. Most of us know only the surface of the bay and its edges, but beneath the water there is a promise of a different world, a world that attracts underwater explorers to places like Fort Wetherill, a mecca for divers from Rhode Island and neighboring states. For those skillful enough to enter it, this is the real bay, the living bay beneath the shimmering surface. For many Rhode Islanders, Narragansett Bay is best appreciated from the shoreline, in a ritual of sunbathing and swimming that has changed very little over the years. No matter that sand has gotten into the lunch and that one's shoulders are beginning to burn, everyone's family album has its obligatory snapshots of a day at the beach. There is something reassuring about a crowded parking lot and a beach packed with people, proof that the day is perfect and that we have picked the right spot to be. For many people, one of the pleasures of enjoying the bay is the companionship, the shared celebration of sun and water that links generations of families.
It's summertime, 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 summertime. Let's shop them books and throw away. Say goodbye to those good days. Put the lime and change your ways. It's summertime. Well, no more studying history and no more reading geography and no more dodging palm tree because it's summertime. It's time to head straight for the mills. It's time to live and have some thrills. Come along and have a ball, a regular free-for-all. Well, are you coming or are you late? You slow folks on my one can wait. Hurry up before I say it's summertime. Well, I'm so happy that I can flip. Oh, how I'd love to take a trip. I'm sorry, teacher, but stick your lip because it's summertime. It's time to head straight for the mills. It's time to live and have some thrills. Come along and have a ball, a regular free-for-all. Well, we'll go swimming every day. No time to work, just time to play. If your folks complain, just say it's summertime. And every night we'll have dance, 'cause what's a vacation with all romance? Oh man, this jive has me in a trance because it's summertime. It's time to head straight for the mills. It's time to live and have some thrills. Come along and have a ball, a regular free-for-all. It's summertime. It's summertime, 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 summertime. It's summertime.
Since the mid-19th century, Rhode Island beaches and resorts have attracted a steady stream of visitors eager to share the delights of a spectacular coastline and the diversions of tourism. But as early as 1897, as this cartoon from Puck magazine illustrates, there were fears that the special charm of places like Newport would be diluted by vast numbers of out-of-state visitors. Today, when tens of thousands come to watch sporting events like the America's Cup races or grand celebrations like the arrival of the tall ships, Rhode Islanders may feel that their worst fears of a tourist invasion have been realized. But perhaps the enthusiasm of these visitors reminds us of the things we might otherwise take for granted. The sounds of the bay, the smell of salt air warmed by the sun, and a radiant sense of space and well-being. Whether we depend on the bay for work or pleasure, we're all concerned about its future. There are forces that threaten the bay and people who protect it. Join us when we return. Narragansett Bay is one of the most studied estuaries in the world, but beneath its surface, there are mysteries and mechanisms that we cannot fathom. One thing we do know is that we are now the keepers of the bay's future. What we do today will determine what kind of bay our children will enjoy. We also know that many of the bay's natural rhythms are delicate and easily upset by human activity. This is as close as most people get to the living creatures of the bay. Salt marshes, tidal pools, and small coves like this are full of life. A small example of the richness of the bay itself. Although much of it is invisible to the naked eye, scientists have made the lives of some of these creatures wonderfully transparent. These are copepods, tiny crustaceans. Like other forms of plankton, they normally float suspended in the water, drifting with the currents throughout the bay. They are food for the more complex organisms which live in the waters of the bay or forage along its bottom. The horseshoe crab is in a class by itself, a living fossil whose form hasn't changed for hundreds of millions of years. This spider crab looks ancient, but in fact it has camouflaged itself by gluing bits of rockweed to its back. Here one has lucked onto a fragment of jellyfish, an especially rich morsel for a scavenger. This crab, a female blue claw, is extracting the meat from a mussel. Around it, a cloud of amphipods, shrimp-like animals which make up the staple diet of stationary organisms like this mud anemone. Its delicate tentacles sting to death the creatures which swim or drift within range. Closely related are the northern star coral and the lined sea anemone. These are the tube feet and sensors of a sea star. They look fragile, but with their powerful suction, the animal can crack open the shell of a quahog and devour the soft body inside. Pollock are one of the important food fishes of the bay, along with hake, a bottom feeder. A rock gunnel pursues his obscure business looking for food along the bottom of a tide pool. Relatives of the cockroach, the earliest colonists called them, and fed them to their pigs. Lobsters enjoy a slightly higher reputation today. Underwater, they are more agile than we might expect in defending their territories or fleeing from danger. These longfin, or summer squid, are actually mollusks, high-tech mollusks. Their eyes are remarkably similar to ours. They can hover with their wings or maneuver quickly by jet propulsion. The bay is layered with living creatures, a city of animals of every size and shape, and every way of making a living. In the penthouse, the upper surface layers of the water, simple planktonic creatures called salps hang in strings like pearls, accompanied by an entourage of amphipods and jellyfish. Down below, at street level, the traffic can be something of a problem. Not long ago, divers needed bulky equipment to reach the bottom of the bay. This rare archival footage shows Navy divers attempting to retrieve test torpedoes in the deep waters off Gould Island. But today, new research devices like this remote-controlled mini rover have made it possible to explore areas of the bay in which divers would be hesitant to venture. This is one of the deepest parts of the bay, 120 feet down, the bottom of the West Passage. This is the benthos, a hidden community of clams and worms. Hermit crabs scuttle across the barren-looking surface, startled by the lights of our camera unit. The murky waters of a harbor or marina are not areas that skin divers are fond of exploring, and the rover reveals why. An underwater landscape clouded by human activity. Every town, every factory, every settlement along the shores of the bay is a potential source of pollution. But history and circumstance have made the Providence River the main source of pollutants in the bay. It's summer, and a sudden downpour over Providence sets in motion a chain of events. From highways, bridges, and city streets, rainwater washes weeks of oil and grime into the storm drain system. And this runoff is added to the metropolitan area's normal flow of wastewater from homes, schools, and factories. Within hours, the combined flow of sewage and stormwater works its way through the sewer system to the treatment facility at Fields Point, south of Providence. Here, as they will perhaps 40 times every year, workers begin a familiar ritual. The system normally handles 56 million gallons of water every day, but after a heavy rainfall, the rate of flow doubles. Suddenly, Fields Point must process 110 million gallons of wastewater. Additional pumps are turned on. At an accelerated rate, the massive quantities of water are put through the first stages of treatment. But then, to avoid overwhelming the system, the water bypasses the last two stages. It is treated with chlorine to kill any microorganisms, then discharged into the bay. Providence's wastewater treatment plants are beginning to improve, thanks to new public interest and financial commitment, but their operators are working at a disadvantage. The basic system was designed almost 90 years ago. During dry weather, sewage and industrial waste are carried through sewer lines to Fields Point. But when it rains, the stormwater, caught in gutters and catch basins, begins to swamp the system. Some of this raw sewage never even reaches Fields Point. It flows directly into the river and bay through 65 overflow pipes. And this may not be the worst of it. The plant's lab monitors the presence of metals in the wastewater passing through it. Rhode Island industries are required to pre-treat their wastewater. Yet each year, 700,000 pounds of metals are discharged into the bay. The precise effect of these pollutants is still being studied, but everyone agrees they cannot be a healthy addition to the life of the bay. Every time it rains and the system allows untreated waste to flow into the Providence River, the upper bay is closed to quahogging for 7 days. Enforcing this ban is the job of the Department of Environmental Management. This is perhaps the most visible example of the many ways the DEM protects the natural resources of Narragansett Bay.
We're coming into the upper bay right now. The bay is closed today. It's closed till the 8th of the month. The bay closes quite frequently. Anytime you get a significant rainfall, they'll close the bay and they'll publish it in the newspapers. Well, all these guys have to be licensed, the commercial shell fishermen, so we enforce that. Plus, any resident can go shell fishing, but he's limited to a half a bushel per day. And you can take that without a license. Granted, we have our share of problems, but for the most part, the commercial shell fisherman is just your average man trying to make an honest living, and we don't have too many problems with the majority of these guys. There's that certain few that want to make the quick buck and they want to make it fast, and there's ways to do it in this industry, as far as the polluted areas and undersized shellfish.
From an infrared camera 400 miles up, satellite photography reveals the extent of development around the Providence River and Upper Bay. Waterfront land has always been valuable. Recently, it has become even more fashionable. Around Providence, for example, an area that has suffered the most from neglect and indifference, some developers and architects now see the potential of an attractive waterfront.
Behind me is the Providence River Bridge, 195 highway ramps existing not only behind me but all along either side of the Providence River. So I think one of the concepts was, what can we do to remove or modify those barriers? Providence probably would not have grown had it not been on water. We have equal historic precedent for summertime enjoyment. Certainly the boardwalk made Atlantic City famous. Why? Because it was something people liked to do. They liked to walk along the water.
A clean bay, safe to swim and fish in, is a realistic but elusive goal. What seems to be just as difficult is to ensure that people can reach the bay. The issue of access is a controversial one. Ironically, in light of the importance of the bay to Rhode Island, we have lagged behind other states in setting guidelines and policy.
It's been our opinion that the whole issue of public access has caught Rhode Island sleeping. It wasn't until the development really hit that people around the state started to feel that they were being closed in and closed away from the shore. There's roughly 400 linear mile of coastline in Rhode Island. There's a great percentage of that is in private ownership. There is simply, at this moment, not enough open space along the coast to accommodate both the resident of Rhode Island, the tourist that comes to Rhode Island, and anyone else that wishes to use the coastline. The major problem is not identifying and not providing for perpendicular access to get from a road to the water. In most cases, or in many cases, you'll have to cross private property or property that's not well defined, whether it's private or public. Therein lies probably the biggest problem in Rhode Island.
Many of the state's public access routes are well marked and maintained. Others, however, are in dispute or have been neglected for so long that using them is less like a stroll to the shore than a walk on the wild side. Welcome to Shoreline Access, Route F7.
All right, that's it. It's private property. I'll have to call the police.
The bay is a treasure for those of us who live here, and a magnet for those who wish they did. But unless its development and use are wisely controlled, the future could be a bad dream of congestion and exploitation, the gradual compromising of a resource that we could easily love to death. The bay will be here tomorrow, but what kind of bay will it be? Many Rhode Islanders have been drawn into the fight to defend the bay. One of the most vocal and resourceful groups has been Save the Bay. It is now an organization with a national reputation, and its strength can best be measured by the commitment of its individual members.
I first swam the bay 10 years ago. I overtrained for it. I was very nervous about it because I'd never been much of a swimmer before I lost my leg, and I didn't know what to expect. I think the philosophy of Save the Bay is probably, that's a tough one. It's like an informed concern that's not remote. It's something that's accessible to people who aren't oceanographers, who aren't biologists, who aren't people necessarily with a lot of intricate knowledge of the bay, but with an overwhelming concern for the bay. Narragansett Bay is the focus of a lot of my experiences since I've come to Rhode Island, and it's been one of those ingredients that's helped me enlarge my perspective of, I think, the whole world. It's something that opens your eyes.
Measured against the scale of the problems that threaten the bay, what can one person do? These swimmers, struggling against wind and current, are a powerful symbol that individual effort can still make a difference. How do Rhode Islanders feel about Narragansett Bay? All you have to do is ask them. Join us when we return.
Oh, these are
What brought you here today? What made you decide to attend?
I'm very much interested in the environment. I'm interested in Narragansett Bay. I want to see it cleaned up, saved. It's an important body of water for ecologically, of course, and for recreation. So that's why I'm here.
Without the bay, I couldn't live here if they didn't have the bay here. I just love it. I love fishing. I love being on the water. Rhode Island wouldn't be the same.
We want to have industry in Rhode Island. We want to have a lot of people using the bay, and I don't think that those two things are incompatible at all.
Well, it's on its way back now with cleaning it up. It's just so many people are aware of the bay being the way it was, so dirty.
Having traveled all around the world, I've never lived in a place that is so beautiful as Newport and Jamestown and just any community which is connected to Narragansett Bay.
Without the bay, there wouldn't be too much to do in this state. Not really. No fishing, no boating.
The single biggest threat, I think, is pollution and neglect.
It is a wonderful place. We went swimming off the boat today, and the children enjoyed it, and it was really wonderful. And I remember when I was younger, jumping off the piers off Newport and swimming all around.
People who love the bay have awakened to the responsibilities that go along with our rights to this remarkable body of water. As more and more Rhode Islanders have rediscovered the bay, we have learned something else. Only we can preserve the bay. Only we can save it. Against the abstract forces of pollution and overdevelopment that might spoil the bay, we can offer a personal commitment. Against ignorance of its delicate internal rhythms, we can offer new research and new knowledge. And against the neglect of the past, we can offer the promise that we will preserve what we love about Narragansett Bay and the hope that there is still time.